Why do you think the way you do about right and wrong? Why do you think some actions or behaviors are good and others bad? Have you ever changed your mind about what is good or bad? If so, on what basis did you change your belief? Was it a scripture that changed your mind? Was it a convincing argument? Or perhaps a personal experience? Or maybe it was being part of a small community or a larger culture that, slowly but surely, chipped away your previous beliefs over the course of time. Where do most people get their ethical beliefs, their judgments about right and wrong? Distinct from the question about the source of most people's ethical beliefs is another important question. How do most Americans get training in ethical reflection? Where do people go to learn how to engage in moral reasoning? In fact, it's rare for a high school to offer a course in ethics, and it's not required in most bachelor degree programs. There is no substantive discussion of ethics in the public square. Think of an ethical issue about which there is some disagreement in culture, say abortion or homosexuality. Now think about how a topic like that is handled on a TV show like, The View, or whatever other show talks about cultural issues. Public discussion is not deep, and it seldom goes to the level of why something might be right or wrong. As such, most Americans will be able to go only about as deep as the TV shows they watch. I think it's important to respond to a moral attitude that is increasingly common among churches and individual Christians. And this attitude asserts that Christians must rethink and change their positions on important ethical issues, rejecting no conduct, but embracing all in the name of love. This attitude is initially appealing, for we should absolutely be willing to scrutinize our beliefs, and everything we do should flow from love. But it raises the question of what real love is, what it requires, and on what basis Christians are to form moral judgments. So let's zoom out for the big picture and start with some very basic things about ethics. First of all, what is ethics? Ethics is the branch of philosophy that considers the moral life and deals with character formation, decision making, and behavior. It is the study and pursuit of the good, how to know it and how to do it. So it's eminently practical. Pursuing the good entails avoiding what is evil. But is there such a thing as good and evil, right and wrong? To many, the answer may seem like a no-brainer. Of course there is such a thing as good and evil. But contrary to the consensus of human history, and I would say contrary to our own common sense, our late modern culture increasingly assumes that objective goodness and objective evil do not exist. Have you ever heard someone say, "That's good for you, but not for me," or "That may be right for their culture, but not for ours"? These expressions reflect moral relativism, which in its strictest form claims that all moral judgment is subjective. At best, whatever the individual or the culture believes about morality is right. Moral relativism is not a recent discovery. As Judges 21 verse 25 observes, there was no king in Israel. Each did what was right in his own eyes. Moral relativism saturates today's culture. We see it all over the media. We experience it more and more often in everyday life when people shrug their shoulders and say, "Who am I to judge? As long as they don't hurt anyone else, then let people do whatever they want." Well, is that correct? Is moral evaluation, assessing something as good or evil, simply a product of a historically conditioned culture that could have gone a different way? Is there absolutely no place in life for moral judgment? Before we simply give it a free pass, we should put moral relativism to the test. And before we can evaluate moral relativism, we must first seek to understand it. So what is this moral relativism? Well, if objective truth is something like 2 plus 2 equals 4, and if a relativist doubts that, then a moral relativist is someone who doubts that there is any truth to moral judgments. Ultimately, there is no such objective truth to right and wrong, good and evil, to a relativist. Now, not everyone who is reluctant to offer a moral judgment is necessarily a moral relativist. Sometimes we don't know enough about a situation to make a determination. In such cases, withholding judgment for or against may be the wisest move. At other times, we may know everything there is to know about the situation, but we simply cannot resolve the dilemma. That is not necessarily moral relativism. Although hesitancy per se is not moral relativism, our collective growing inability or unwillingness to give evaluative judgments to an increasing number of attitudes and behaviors that we used to be clear about, this could be evidence not so much of humility as of a growing moral relativism. Maybe not everything is black and white, but that shouldn't mean that everything is gray either. At any rate, full-blown moral relativism is different than simple and virtuous epistemic humility. Closely related to the question of moral relativism is the question of what grounds morals. Some philosophers claim that the moral law is grounded in one's own inward feelings. So when we say that something is wrong or evil, all we're really saying is, I don't like that. For example, we all recognize that if I say peanut butter is bad, it's an opinion and has no truth value. If there is an objective truth underneath it all, it is that I don't like peanut butter. We could all agree to that. Well, that's all that's meant, or at least that's the only truth communicated when I say peanut butter is bad. Now apply that not just to literal taste, but to moral judgments, and you have moral relativism. A thoroughgoing moral relativist would say that moral evaluation is just expressing a matter of taste. In The Brothers Karamazov, Fyodor Dostoevsky observes that, quote, without God and immortal life, all things are lawful. And if God doesn't exist, man is the king of the earth, of the universe, magnificent. Only how is he going to be good without God? That is the question, end quote. Well, what does this mean? Moral relativism is, of course, a natural corollary of atheism. If you don't believe in a transcendent, objective ground of the good, and all reality is just a bunch of stuff reducible to material atoms, if we are nothing more than stardust, then it would be hard to ground moral evaluation in anything beyond individual taste, or at most, communal preference and tradition. To the true believer in moral relativism, then, moral judgment is nothing but an expression of cultural or individual preference or taste. And then there is no basis on which to make a moral judgment or reform something for moral improvement. If moral relativism is true, then there is no such thing as real evil. Well, until the crowd decides there is. Then there arises a very rigid, firm ethic that is based not on a Christian worldview, but more on something that Friedrich Nietzsche said would remain after the demise of the Christian worldview, namely the will to power. The crowd can easily create a new right and wrong based on current consensus. Once decided, the tolerance of relativism tends to fade. The crowd can be very confident in its judgments. And if you're in the minority or don't toe the line, you better get on board. In real life, then, moral relativism can turn out to be just as pushy, intolerant, violent, and brutal as any other moral philosophy, especially when one moral relativist asserting his untethered autonomy bumps up against another convinced moralist. No group of people is more susceptible to endorsing and following the whims of the crowd than politicians, who constantly gauge the direction of the wind and make sure they fall in line. Yet, what the crowd says and what the government says are irrelevant to the question of morality. Christian moral reasoning is not based on what the majority believes or on what those in power are legislating. Get on the right side of history may be rhetorically powerful, but it fails as a moral argument. It is a smokescreen that is used to disguise what it really means, the current opinion of the crowd. The French revolutionaries, slave traders, and Nazis at the height of their exuberance and influence all thought that they were on the right side of history, which is why they acted in the ways they did. So we should ask, whose history, when, and who's actually right? But relativism is not right, and neither is the moral certainty that is based on crowdsourcing and power. It takes quite a bit of self-deception and willful ignorance to say that there is no such thing as transcendent good, or that the moral good is determined democratically. For the believer, there is a transcendent moral order, and it is rooted in God's nature. So I will proceed under the assumption that there is such a thing as the good, and that it transcends any given cultural moment. One final thing, how can we know the good? First, we know it by nature. The reality of natural law is reflected in the fact that all cultures of all times, despite the variations, have a fairly unified set of moral codes. In addition to natural law, Christians know goodness through the special revelation mediated through Scripture. So, the version of ethics or morality on offer in popular culture today is moral relativism, which claims that there is no such thing as good and evil, or for that matter, truth. Your truth and your good are simply whatever you desire and assert. At first, this approach to ethics could look very attractive, especially to a society that values individual freedom above all else. On closer inspection, though, it is nonsense to claim the truth that there is no moral truth. It's impractical to try to live without the categories of good and evil. It goes against the deepest moral intuitions of humanity, and it is dangerous. Fortunately, most relativists are inconsistent relativists. We should be glad that there are few, if any, thoughtful, thoroughgoing moral relativists out there. But it is important to know what moral relativism is so that you can recognize it when you hear it, combat it, and avoid being pulled in or persuaded by it. In fact, what is good and what is not good cannot be determined by individual or communal preferences. Goodness transcends my momentary feelings and our culture's current opinions. Therefore, as Christians, we should never base our moral judgment simply on the way we feel or on what the majority believes and practices. Do not follow after the many to evil, says Exodus 23:2. It takes a great deal of confidence and courage to stand up to the crowd and to understand that the crowd's insistence that X is right does not make it right. As the crowd shouts for Jesus' crucifixion, it takes courage to follow him anyway. That is what it means to be in the world but not of it, and to be a disciple of Christ. The inescapable truth that there is a right and a wrong, a good and an evil, points us away from moral relativism and toward the source of goodness itself.